I've often argued that climate alarmism is as dangerous in a man as rabies is in a dog. For climate alarmism poisons the brain. It renders a person incapable of logical thought. And concerningly, it leads to a propensity not only for a person to want societal harm, but actually for acts of self-harm. Just take this recent example of one of Australia's social media influencers, this girl Abbie Chatfield. Just have a listen to what she says here.
This is not a gotcha. This is a genuine question to parents or people who are pregnant or people who have decided to have a baby, like you're doing IVF or something. People who either have had a baby or have decided to have a baby in the past year or two, okay? How do you rationalize having a baby with the climate crisis? I'm not asking this as a gotcha. I'm not going, how dare you? I'm genuinely asking because I want kids. I just don't feel that it's possible for me to have them with the climate collapse happening right now. Like, I notice the climate changing every day. There's something strange going on, whether it's internationally or even just in my home.
Now, the fact that her brain has been so infected by climate alarmism of this degree is both sad and tragic. And just listen as she goes on.
So I'm just wondering, how did you, when you made the decision, factor in the climate crisis? Because it seems as though we only have like max 100 years left until things are completely done. And that isn't including all of the lead up of famine and no water and the amount of deaths from natural disasters and lack of insurance and financial instability and AI and blah, blah, blah. But unfortunately, I'm aware of the climate crisis and I think about it most of the day, every day. We can't have a kid. We can't have a kid when the climate is fucking collapsing around us. Like, I'm literally looking at the weather right now. I'm like, this isn't normal. Like, it's not normal for this time of year to be this windy and extreme and pouring rain and sunshine. Like, it's not normal.
Now, it would be easy to argue that this is just Darwinism at work. But we really need to help this poor girl because it's not Abbie's fault. It's not her fault that she has been so propagandised. She's been fed a daily diet of false information, of scaremongering from people that use climate alarmism for their own profit and for their own political advantage.
I want to have a kid. I just feel like I want to cry. I feel like the opportunity and the choice has been taken away from me and from so many people my age and younger who, like, I'm 30, who want to have children, but like, well, I can't. I can't have kids. I don't want to be worrying about if there's water or food for my child in 30 years and look back and go, oh my God, when I was 30, I knew this would happen.
And she's been subject to that on a daily basis since she is a toddler. So it is no wonder that she has these delusional thoughts. So what we need to do is go through the data, go through the evidence sensibly and calmly to try and see if we can deprogram this young girl, and hopefully that she's still got some functional brain cells left that she can use some rational thought process to understand how she's been lied to and she's been propagandized. But firstly, Abbie, there is no climate crisis. There has been no climate collapse. Floods, droughts, bad weather, storms are the natural order of things. Go back and read Dorothy McKellar's poem about Australia being a land of droughts and flooding rains. That is the norm. So let's try, Abbie, and go through some of the data to debunk this destructive, self-harming theories that you've been brainwashed into believing. Now, firstly, Abbie, the first place to look, I would suggest, is go to the data from a place called MDAT. This is data produced by the University of Louvain. It's the International Disasters Database. Now, even in that data, the methodology that they use has a propensity to show an increasing trend. But their data this century shows there has been no increase in the number of climate disasters. In fact, if anything, maybe a slight decline. But there's been no increase in climate disasters. So the idea that things are getting worse, so we're having more climate disasters, is completely debunked by the most authoritative source of data that we have on the planet, and that is MDAT, the International Data Disaster Base. Secondly, Abbie, you go on here about famine, no water, and deaths from natural disasters.
The climate crisis, because it seems as though we only have like max 100 years left until things are completely done. And that isn't including all of the lead up of famine and no water and the amount of deaths from natural disasters.
Well, Abbie, I don't know who puts these ideas into your head, but a child born today is safer than at any time in human history and at a lower risk from a death from a natural disaster than any time in human history. Over the past 100 years, there has been a remarkable decrease in deaths from natural disasters. It's something like a 98% decrease in the number of people that have died from a natural disaster. And we have no reason to believe that declining trend will not continue for the years to come. So to believe somehow or be concerned that your child is at risk from a death from a natural disaster is simply a completely illogical thought. It is completely contrary to what the evidence says. You should be confident, Abbie, that if you have a child, that child is going to live in a world where they're at a lower risk of death from a natural disaster than any time in human history. And yet somehow or other, you've been propagandised to believe the exact opposite. Secondly, you're concerned about famines. Well, thankfully today, famines are virtually a thing of the past thanks to fossil fuels. Most of the famines, the terrible famines over history, have often been caused by government interference. But today, famines are something we read about in the past. Those tragic famines during the Great Leap Forward in China, the Ukrainian famine forced on by the communists, the Russian communists and Bolsheviks, the Bengali famine of 1943. It is often, I said, the government that causes these famines. And today we can be thankful that food production and especially food crop yields are at record highs. Almost every crop that you look at, Abbie, look at the data, every crop, the crop yield is increasing and has increased dramatically over the last 50 to 60 years. More CO2 in the atmosphere helps the crops grow. It makes them grow faster and stronger and increases food production. Combine that with fossil fuel fertilizers, Abbie, and fossil fuel farming equipment, you can see here on all these charts and all these graphs that we are growing, the world is growing more food than ever before. The risk of death by famine has never been lower and crop yields have never been higher. It's also worth noting, Abbie, that a child born today is going to be born onto the planet that is far more greener than what it's been in recent years. Someone born today as compared to someone born 20 years ago, there is more green leaf matter on the planet, which trees and plants and greenery on the planet, the size of Australia. That's how much global greening we have had over the last 20 years. So if you have a child you're bringing in the world today, that child is going to be born on a greener planet than when you were born. Next, Abbie, you're concerned about no water. Well, firstly, have a look at some of these rainfall charts, firstly for Eastern Australia, and you can see that yes, we have ups and downs, we have periods of floods and droughts, but over a period of 120 years, there has been no trend in floods or droughts. It's the same for our food bowl, the Murray-Darling Basin. 120 years of data shows no trend. There's no trend that we are getting less rainfall in those important food growing areas. And if you look at some of the peer-reviewed research, going back into Sydney, back into the early 1800s, you can see, again, whether it's the number of rainfall days, the total rainfall, the rainfall intensity, there is no trend. So the idea that we're going to run out of water simply defies all logic. And of course, today we have the technology, if we need it, of course, the desalination plants, but mainly, Abbie, they have been a complete and utter waste of money, billions wasted in relation to the climate scare campaign. There is no evidence whatsoever that a future generation of Australians should be worried about having no water. We'll go through periods of droughts again, we'll go through periods of floods, but there is no trend in the data. Now, Abbie, you also go on here about lack of insurance. Well, have a look at this chart, Abbie. This starts in 1990. It uses the data from Munich Re and the World Bank. And what it does, it measures or it records the cost of global climate disasters as a percentage of global GDP. And you can see since 1990 that varies between about 0.1% and 0.4 or 0.5% of global GDP. But again, you can see the trend is downwards. The economic cost of climate disasters is actually declining. And you are worried about insurance and financial instability. The cost is becoming less and less. That is what the data shows. And perhaps, Abbie, if you are really concerned, and again, I don't blame you because you've never been taught these things in school, go back and study Australia's history. Start, Abbie, with our bushfires. Go back and read about the bushfires in Australia, the Black Thursday bushfires from 1851. Go and have a look at that magnificent painting by William Strutt of that period, if you're concerned about bushfires. Or maybe the maps of the bushfires and the stories of the bushfires from 1939 in New South Wales and Victoria. Or the Tasmanian bushfires of 1967. Bushfires are a natural part of the Australian environment. And the good news, Abbie, is if you look at the data shows that the amount of area being burnt by bushfires in Australia is declining, as it is all around the world. Then, Abbie, go back and look at our Australian flood history. What year do you think was the most deadly year for floods in this country? The most deadly flood event in this country, you've got to go back to 1852 down in Gundagai. And what you should do, Abbie, go down there on Gundagai. You can see where the Murrumbidgee River is there. Go and have a look at the flood gauge marker they've got there and look at the floods through recorded history in that spot. You can see, Abbie, most of those terrible floods were over 100 years ago, back in the 1800s. Also, Abbie, go and have a look at the photos from the Great Flood of Brisbane, Brisbane's worst flood. In what year? 1893. Then, Abbie, this is one of my favourite photos from the floods in Maitland in 1955. Here you can see the flood at Maitland Railway Station and compare that to Maitland Railway Station today. Again, that a flood back in 1955, Abbie. So this idea that our floods are getting worse when we're exposed is complete and utter nonsense. And then there's droughts, Abbie. Go back and read about the history of Australia's Federation drought from 1895 to 1903. Go and have a look at some of those old photographs of dried up riverbeds from back in that period to understand how bad droughts have been in Australia. We live in a land of droughts and flooding rains. Those droughts will come again and those droughts will break again. The idea that droughts are getting worse, Abbie, is complete and utter nonsense. And cyclones, Australia's most terrifying and destructive disaster. Well, the most powerful cyclone and the most deadly cyclone to strike Australia. When was it? Back in 1899, Cyclone Mahina, which killed over 400 Australians up there in northern Queensland. Then, of course, Abbie, before you were born, Cyclone Tracy. And if you look at the trend, if you look at the data, look at this graph from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, and you can see the trend in cyclones is actually trending downwards, both for severe and non-severe. So an Australian born this year is likely, as you see this data, is going to live in an Australia that is experiencing less cyclone dangers than what it was 30, 40 and 50 years ago. So Abbie, when you say the climate is not normal, an unstable, erratic, changing climate is par for the course. It is what has happened throughout human history. But there is simply no trend in the data showing it's getting worse. In fact, if you look at the data, if anything, things are getting better. Now, Abbie, also think about your position, about how you don't want to have kids. Think about if your mother or your grandmother or your great-grandmother or your great-great-grandmother thought exactly the same thing. You wouldn't be alive today. Remember our past generations. They've been through the Great Depression of the 1930s. They've been through World War II. Remember when the Japanese subs came into Sydney Harbour, when we were losing ships off our coasts here in New South Wales? What the concern would have been for the future then? Then, Abbie, you had the 1960s, the risk of nuclear war. But our parents and grandparents kept on pushing on then. And then, Abbie, there was the 1970s Ice Age scare, the coming Ice Age that we have been told about. All these scare campaigns have been debunked one after the other. Thankfully, Abbie, the previous generations, as I said, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and great-great-great-great-great-grandparents going backwards looked for the future. They understood that we could have a better future, that the world is improving and getting better. They dismissed the scare campaigns of the day and pursued having families. So please, Abbie, look at the data and try and realise that you have been conned and tricked.